any definition of what Judeo-Christian means. Partly that is because the term has no basis, no ancestry in either Christianity or in Judaism. It is, in fact, an artifact of the Cold War. When Eisenhower said, America is a Judeo-Christian nation, believing in one God, believing in the Ten Commandments, etc., versus the godless communists across the sea. That is dividing the world into two. That was the original intent, or one of the intents of that, which is fine, as far as it goes. But of course, there's much more to be said than that. The problem, or the limitations of the notion of the Judeo-Christian tradition, is that everything that Jews and Christians share in common, really share in common, is also shared by Muslims. I did a little exercise in one of my classes, and I said, now that you know about Judaism, let's find out what you think Jews and Christians have in common. So we made a big list of beliefs, values, and practices. Every common belief and practice or value is also shared by Muslims. So Judeo-Christian is a bit too narrow, objectively speaking. What about theologically speaking? As Christians, don't we affirm that Christianity uniquely depends upon Judaism, upon Israel, that it uniquely depends upon the root of Abraham, and therefore we can justifiably say there is something uniquely Judeo-Christian. True, again, to an extent, that there's a limitation in that too. As soon as we try to define what we receive from Judaism and how we interpret those beliefs, we are cutting Jews out. Judeo-Christian really means Christian, the Christian appropriation of the Jewish heritage, which is fine so long as we say that that's what we're doing. So as a foundation for interfaith dialogue, it has limits. Now there's a much more ancient term which actually derives from Islam, which is called peoples of the book. We are all peoples of the book. We all acknowledge scriptures as the basis for everything. Well, again, this is true to a certain degree. Theologically, however, Christianity is not based ultimately on a book, but on a person. We understand the book as referring to the person, but the person is the center of Christian faith. So to think theologically of Christians as the people of the book is useful because we too have scriptures, and the content of our scriptures has much overlap with the other two faiths. But it doesn't quite get us all the way. It doesn't allow for agreement and disagreement over key issues without subsuming the others under our own umbrella. So even much more modern than either of these is this term children of Abraham. Now the virtue of this image, and this is the one I'm going to promote tonight as sort of the basis for this series of thinking about the significance of Abraham, is that all three of our faiths share and affirm this notion that we lay claim to Abraham as our ancestor and that he is the example we follow. There's no dispute over that. There is also no dispute over the fact that others are also children of Abraham. So Christians acknowledge Jews as children of Abraham. Muslims acknowledge Jews and Christians as children of Abraham. So there's no debate about that either. There's plenty of room for disagreement, as in any family, right, over key issues. But the image is productive because it suggests that there is something deeper than simply the beliefs or the values or the practices. It is rooted in story, or as in the Christian tradition we would say, it's rooted in salvation history. So what I want to do tonight is talk a bit more about what is this image of Abraham as father, which links or provides a basis for linking us all together. And not in an apologetic way. I don't want to argue for a particular position here. Actually, I will make an argument. But my point is, I'm going to try to demonstrate that there is an objective presence of a threefold understanding of Abraham within each of these faiths, within Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A threefold understanding, this three-dimensional understanding of what makes Abraham important as an ancestor. And all three faiths share the same template, the same map of why Abraham is important. So what I want to do is, well, I'm going to skip this thing and talk about that a little later. I want to talk about scripture and tradition as a basis for which, as a Catholic thinker to embark on this. Catholics acknowledge both the written scriptures as well as the whole tradition of the church in interpreting those scriptures, and this is true of Jews as well as Muslims. We all have books, and we all have communities that interpret those books. Scripture, however, already represents an interfaith dialogue, or at least an intra-faith dialogue. Because within every canon, whether it's the Quran or the Old Testament or the New Testament, there is embraced a diversity of perspectives, sometimes even contradictory perspectives on certain issues. The whole point of a canon is to canonize a diversity of perspectives that can enter into dialogue with one another as we seek to relate all these books to a single message, a single interpretation. So already there is dialogue within the text, whichever scripture we're talking about. And outside the scripture, in the larger traditions of the community, there are also multiple readings of scripture, which bear witness to the fact that there is a dialogue going in within that community as to its significance. And this is especially true when we look at the traditions about Abraham, the extra-biblical, extra-canonical traditions about Abraham in all three of our traditions. Actually, Christians basically take over the Jewish extra-biblical traditions about Abraham and use them as their own. So basically, there's only two sets of traditions that stand outside the written word. There's the Jewish and the Islamic. And the Islamic are very much indebted to the Jewish traditions about Abraham. In fact, what the Quran does is it canonizes those traditions, raising them to the level of divine revelation. So there's already this idea of dialogue going within Scripture and tradition. Now, the shared assumption of all the faiths, all three of the Abraham faiths about Abraham, is that Abraham's own identity, his own faith, undergoes a development. This is why it's a complicated matter. It's not just a matter of saying Abraham is one thing. The Quran actually puts it very nicely and succinctly. In Surah 6, Surah is like a chapter. God says, we raise whom we will in degrees. And he's speaking about his election of Abraham, his choosing of Abraham. We raise people by degrees. So there's a progressive development in which the person whom God guides comes to greater and greater realization of who God is and what is called and what is demanded of him or her. So that's a very succinct way of putting it. In the letter of James, this is the New Testament letter of James, you also have this recognition of development in the story of Abraham's faith. He says, was not our ancestor Abraham justified by actions when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? That's Genesis 22. You see that faith was active along with his actions, and faith was brought to completion by the actions. The faith of Abraham is Genesis 15. That's where that is articulated. Genesis 22 is his offering of his son. So even within the Christian tradition, there's an acknowledgement of many stages of Abraham's faith journey. And so that is something that I'm going to try to examine, how these stages develop. And guess what? There are three stages, and the Torah contains all of them. The book of Genesis. The book of Genesis, the three key chapters to remember are 15, 17, and 22. 15, 17, 22. You remember those, you'll know the story of Abraham. These are the key moments that express what makes Abraham worthy of the special attention, the special destiny that God calls him to. In Genesis 15, and we'll look at this one later on in more depth, God promises an offspring to Abraham, promises him a son. And Abraham, we are told, trusts in God's promise, believes God's promise, has faith in God's promise, and as Paul said in the earlier passage, it was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. So Abraham's trust in God's promise leads to the designation that he is claimed to be righteous or upright, as the Quran would put it in its own language. 2 chapters later, we have the story we began with, the covenant of circumcision. Here, Abraham is commanded to perform a mitzvah, a commandment. Circumcise your sons, all your male servants. That is the sign of the covenant that I am making with you. Abraham is commanded to perform a commandment, and in doing so, this is an expression of his blamelessness. Walk before me and be blameless, said God at the beginning of that reading. So blamelessness, in the context of Genesis 17, appears to me performing mitzvot, performing commandments, specific commandments of God. Finally, in Genesis 22, Abraham submits his will to God. This is when God commands him, without any assurances of anything, kill your son, offer him to me as a sacrifice. Abraham submits his will to God's will and is prepared to perform it. And after the test is complete, the angel of God announces to Abraham, now I know that you fear God. Now I know that you fear God, or fear in the sense of reverence. Positive. Although I like the term fear, because I would be pretty afraid if someone suggested that I should offer my son as a sacrifice. So, here are the three dimensions of Abraham's specialness as an ancestor. He is the source of righteousness as the one who trusts. He is the source of blamelessness as the one who performs commandments. And he is the source of fear of God, God-fearing, as the one who is willing to submit his will to God. So notice that there are three, and by the way, I already mentioned, well, you had already told me correctly, there are 3 times God makes a covenant with Abraham. Guess which chapters those are in? These are the chapters. So each time God makes the same covenant with Abraham, it is referenced by a different virtue, if you will, by a different aspect or dimension of his faith. And move to the next one here. Not only that, but I had said earlier that even within Scripture there is a dialogue. Why do you have 3 versions of the covenant? Is because the Torah is based on 3 sources. At least if you follow the modern scholarly hypothesis that Moses didn't write everything, but it was that what we have in the first 5 books of the Bible is a composite of several different versions that have been woven together very artfully to make something greater than the sum of their parts. It is also interesting that these 3 chapters with these 3 iterations of the covenant reflect each of the 3 so-called strands that make up this part of the Torah, the Pentateuch. And we call these the Yahwist, the priestly strand, and the Elohist. We're not going to go into a lesson about the theories of the composition of the Pentateuch, but my point is simply that even at a scholarly level, it's very clear that this notion of a development, a journey that Abraham is undertaking, each unveiling a new dimension of what it means to follow God, is itself rooted in whoever composed this. There was once an Orthodox rabbi who, when he was told the documentary hypothesis, he said, well, what do you call the person who put it all together? And the German theologian, whoever it was, says, we call him R for redactor, for editor. And the rabbi said, no, you should call him R for rabbi because he is our teacher. Whoever wove these stories together in the way we have it, this is the canonical meaning. This is the canonical meaning of all of these things. So that is the teacher, whoever put these all together. So that's sort of an aside. So at an academic level as well as the level of the canonical text, you have a development, you have a dialogue of different aspects or attributes. And this, not only the virtues of Abraham himself, but the very sequence that is found in Genesis of 1, 2, 3, of 15, 17, 22. That sequence is told, is acknowledged by all 3 Abrahamic faiths. So interestingly, the sequence itself is, in a sense, canonical across the faiths. We already saw in the letter of James, he said, first there was faith and then there was Abraham's action in the offering of his son. Paul speaks of before and after circumcision. So that's Genesis 15 and 17. So the New Testament, the earliest Christian writings, are cognizant of the significance of the order of Abraham's development. The Quran is not presented in historical order. It's presented in thematic order. But when we step back from the text and look to the tradition of the Muslim community interpreting those texts, we'll see they happen to organize it exactly in the same way as Jews and Christians do. That is to say, they see Abraham's his belief in God's promise as first, Then comes the connection with his performing of God's commands, and then finally ends with the sacrifice or near sacrifice of the Son. Isn't that interesting? All three have the same, acknowledge the same sequence. Yeah. My argument. What makes Jews and Christians and Muslims Abrahamic is not only their genealogy, that they all claim Abraham as father, but their shared attention to Abraham's three-dimensional character. All three faiths affirm the importance of all three dimensions. Secondly, the presence of this development in the canonical order of the Torah in Genesis makes it a normative starting point, at least for Jews and Christians, as they engage in Muslims and with one another in dialogue. In other words, this is not just me making this up, it's part of Revelation. That's my argument. Okay. The plan, what am I going to talk about beyond this? So following this canonical sequence of Genesis 15, 17, and 22, that development of Abraham's character, we will examine one facet of Abraham's character each evening that highlights some of the distinctive traits of one of the Abrahamic faiths. That's why I have Abraham the Christian today, Abraham the Jew next time, and Abraham the Muslim for the third week. I didn't jumble the sequence up because I wanted to have Christians first, but rather because I'm following the sequence of the Torah, that Christians found a special interest in Abraham's faith. But I'm also going to examine how the other two religions develop this same facet in similar or different ways. So again, my point is that it's not just that Christians are interested in Abraham's faith. All three are interested in his faith. But it has a particular importance for the Christian argument for claiming descent from Abraham, as we saw with Paul. So I'm going to start out with that there. Paul's crucial argument is actually in his letter to the Galatians. And what I've done here is I've put in red when he's quoting Genesis, and I tell you which verse of Genesis he's quoting. This is an abbreviated form of his argument, but let's read it. Paul says, just as Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, so you see, those who believe are descendants of Abraham. And the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, declared the good news beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the Gentiles shall be blessed in you. For this reason, those who believe are blessed with Abraham who believed. Abraham is exemplar. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. The text does not say, and to offsprings, as of many, but it says, and to your offspring, that is, to one person, who is Christ. Paul was a bit bold in making that totally contextless argument, but we'll see what he means by that. My point is this, he says. The Torah, by which he means the covenant of circumcision, and which is ramified by the Sinai covenant, which came 430 years later, he says, does not annul the covenant previously ratified by God, so as to nullify the promise. For it is, if the inheritance comes from the Torah, it no longer comes from the promise. But God granted it to Abraham through the promise, and if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So Paul is conscious not only of the sequence of events in Abraham's life, but of the chronological sequence of Abraham with respect to the Sinai covenant, which is the covenant for Israel specifically. So this is prior to it, he says, and so